Well, good day, everyone. Glad to have you here on what day is it? Wednesday. We don't usually do these on Wednesday. I'm so glad to have you all here for a very special live with Kevin, which, as you might know, eventually will become a part of our podcast. So, whatever social platform that you might be on, I hope that you will take a second and go in the comments and say hello. Tell us where you're from. We'd love to know that, and that will make this have more of a community feel, number one. And the second thing it will do is lead to a better conversation, because once you get used to typing in there, then you will be willing to type in there with your questions and comments, because once Matt joins us, our guest, I want you to imagine that this is like you're joining us at the table and we're having a cup of coffee or a glass of water or whatever you might be drinking at this time of day for you. And so if you have questions and comments and ideas, please share them. That will make for a better conversation and eventually a better podcast episode. So if you didn't know, or you didn't notice up in the top corner, this eventually will be an episode of the Remarkable Leadership Podcast. And so before I kick that off directly, I need to do a countdown, because that's where we will start the actual where we will trip. Man, I'm having trouble talking this morning. Glad this isn't on the podcast part, where we will clip the video to start the podcast. So that, Marissa, will be in 3, 2, 1. Culture, organizational culture, team culture is misunderstood, which is one reason why it is underappreciated for its power and ability to transform organizations for the better or the worse. Today, we're going to talk about what culture is and how to transform it for the better results, better communication, better retention. And those are just a start of the list. Welcome to another episode of the Remarkable Leadership Podcast, where we are helping leaders grow personally and professionally to lead more effectively and make a bigger difference for their teams, organizations, and the world. If you're listening to this podcast, you could have been with us live, or you could be with us for future episodes live. To learn more about that, so that you can get this valuable information sooner, and just go to our Facebook or LinkedIn groups and sign up there. You can do that by going to remarkablepodcast.com/Facebook or remarkablepodcast.com/LinkedIn to learn when we'll be having future live episodes, because nearly every one of these episodes was once live with a studio or social media audience. Today's episode is brought to you by our new book, The Long Distance Team, Designing a Team for Everyone's Success. You can learn more about how to help your team be more effective in the future of work by going to longdistanceteambook.com. And with that, it's probably time to bring in our guest. Let me bring him on stage, so to speak. Here he is. Let me introduce him to you. His name is Matt Mayberry. He's an internationally acclaimed keynote speaker and global expert on leadership development, culture change, and organizational performance. His insights on leadership and business performance have been featured in Forbes, Fox News, Business Insider, Fortune, NBC, ESPN, and other major media outlets. He's here with us today in part because he's the author of a brand new book, Culture is the Way. You see it behind him if you're watching us. His clients include organizations like JP Morgan Chase, Allstate Insurance, Phillips 66, Mack Trucks, Fifth Third Bank, and the FBI. In his prior life, Matt was a linebacker for the Indiana Hoosiers and the Chicago Bears. He took the lessons he learned on the field and in the locker room and took it straight to the boardroom. And I'm so glad that you're with us today, Matt. Welcome to the Remarkable
Thanks so much for having me, Kevin. Look forward to it.
You are not the first NFL linebacker who's been a guest on this show. We'll put a link in the show notes, everybody, to the conversation I had with Gary Brackett, who was a linebacker for the Indianapolis Colts after being a linebacker for Rutgers, et cetera. 2 Big Ten guys. There you go.
Much more, although Gary had a much more successful career than I. I'm sure we'll dig into that.
He did win a Super Bowl. We'll just leave it at that, right?
I like to joke around that I was an almost NFL guy. I'm sure we'll get into a little bit of that backstory there. But, Gary's, I don't know him personally, but great career.
So we've got folks joining us from Long Island and St. Louis and Florida. And, we worked for a while, Matt, to make this happen. And it took us a while to get here. We've had a couple of fits and starts, but I'm so glad that you're here. And so for those of you that are joining us live, continue to put in your comments, questions, tell us where you're from. We'd love to know that. But I want to start here, Matt, with you. And that is sort of, you do have this unique backstory of being a football player, and now you do the kind of work really that I do as well. What led you to doing this kind of work?
It was really unplanned. A lot of people, I think, when they, may look at it now, I even have a lot of close friends who thought that this was a whole scheme and planned out, that, hey, once my playing days were over with, that this is what I'd be doing. And really, it's the furthest thing from the truth. Long story short, Kevin, I got hurt back in 2010. So I got hurt in the preseason. So the preseason is a pivotal moment for a rookie, right? I mean, you're on the brink of making the team. You start at fourth string linebacker, you work your way up to second string. And all eyes are on you. Can you handle the pressure? Can you make it in the NFL? And I was having a great training camp, but I got injured. I suffered an ankle injury in the first preseason game playing the San Diego Chargers, and that was the end of my NFL career. So literally one game, my very first game in the NFL, my very first opportunity, one dream, one goal, it just completely ended like that in the blink of an eye, one game.
And playing for your hometown team, even.
And playing for my hometown team, and it was a bigger moment than you would realize, just partly because, I was a former, I'm sure we won't probably get into it here in this podcast, but, overcame some trials and tribulations, growing up there in the Chicago suburbs, drug addict, nearly lost my life on multiple occasions, almost threw my life away. My best sport was actually baseball, got kicked off the baseball team. So I was a very bad, teen, getting in all kinds of trouble, really breaking my mother and father's heart. So when I got injured in the NFL, that was much bigger than just like, hey, here's a guy who wanted to make it in the NFL and play in the NFL. It was this whole accumulation of just overcoming adversity from, really when I was 13 years old all the way up to, 16, 17 years old. But in that moment, to answer your question specifically, Kevin, I was depressed. I was massively depressed. I'm sure, you've probably seen in the news that what happens when an athletic career is over with, you go into depression, the suicide rate is up at an all-time high. And you lose your identity because for so long, so much of your life, that sport is your identity. But luckily I got asked to speak at a leadership event. So even though I have a walking boot on and I really can't walk, I tear a bone off of my ankle, my football NFL career is over with. And at this point, I didn't know what was going to, take shape from my life. I had no idea what was in store, but I met a man by the name of Stedman Graham a month before I got injured. And he asked me to speak at this leadership event when he found out that I got injured. And I ended up speaking at that event, getting a D in public speaking in college and being terrified to speak in front of a group of 10 people. I had no idea what I was doing, but, I figured, hey, nothing else is going on in my life. So let me take this opportunity. And that was really the rest of my, the start of my journey. That was the beginning of birthing a new career, speaking at that one event, and then word of mouth got her out from there.
Well, that's really awesome. And now we're here largely we're here because of your new book, Culture is the Way. And so that's really where I want to focus our time today. So let's start with the question that I sort of teased in the open about what is culture anyway? Different people have different definitions. I have a definition. I'm curious. Well, I know because I've read the book, but what's your definition of culture? What is it from your perspective?
It's a very fantastic and important question, Kevin. I think one of the things I do in the book is really try to drive clarity around what is culture and why is it so important? Because, really for the past 12 years, I've seen a huge misconception of what culture is, what it's intended to do in an organizational setting, and also the importance of it. It's not just fluff and, kind of what people want to hear. I mean, it is the one biggest competitive advantage that really every leader has at their disposal. And I define culture as behavior at scale. And I think the athlete in me, playing in college, playing throughout, getting that front row opportunity in the NFL, the very short time I was there, seeing what the best organizations, the best teams do, how they're structured, the clear expectations. And really, ultimately, it's not what we say. It's not what we proclaim our culture to be. It's how we behave when the CEO or the head coach is not around. And it's behavior at scale. And it's the easiest and most simple way I can define culture. Because you see a lot of organizations, and you probably see this, traveling all throughout the country in your work. A lot of leaders will think that, hey, we have our cute core values here. We're going to post them throughout the headquarters. This is our culture. And we even got this huge page dedicated on our website about what our culture is and how important it is. But at the end of the day, when you start to walk into an organization and spend 30 days, with their leaders and the rest of the employees, especially when the leaders aren't present in that moment, you'll start to see very clearly of what that culture is.
So why is it? I mean, we've never talked about it more than we do now, right?
Right.
I've had a number of guests on over time talking about culture. Our new book has a big component that's about culture. So if so many people are writing about it and talking about it and apparently worried about it, why is it so misunderstood?
I mean, I think we could spend 2 hours here just talking about why it's misunderstood. I think number one, it's misunderstood. And really part of the reason why I think leaders don't fully immerse themselves in it and haven't really for the past, let's say 10, 15, 20 years. You're starting to see this shift, like you said, right now, accelerating that change a little bit. But I think the number one reason is, short term, the instant gratification that we all cling to. We cling to instant gratification. We want to, hey, change our operational procedures. We want to drive our sales, effectiveness in the marketplace. We want to do this, and digital transformations going on here, and a million things are running around. And in a lot of those things, you can create change, within a month, within a couple of weeks. Maybe not fully, but you couldn't create a good amount of change within the first couple of weeks. Now, changing a culture though, and building cultural excellence, that's a long-term endeavor. There's a start date and there is no end date. I think one of the reasons why a lot of leaders get sidetracked and they get paralyzed in their effort to build and improve their workplace culture is because it is a constant ongoing thing. And I think that, at the end of the day, when the pace of business picks up and other things in your life are accelerating, and then you add in personal complications on top of that, it's very easy to get sidetracked and kind of have the blinders up and deflectors of, what's important and what's not.
So I put this on a lower third a little bit ago because I thought we might be heading there, but I do want to explore this because you do have this experience in football that, especially for sports fans, is interesting. But I think as it relates to culture, that's where I'd like us to go. Like, what did you learn from the culture of sports or football that has implications or are lessons for all of us who aren't in that realm?
So many, so many. And the easiest way I can describe it and kind of what it's done to my life and how it's benefited my career, both personally and professionally, is I don't have my MBA, right? My parents don't have a business. Prior to me starting my business, 12 years ago, had no really business experience. And really what I did, Kevin, was take everything I learned from the game of football with the greatest coaches that I've ever had. How do they build team? How do they change behavior? How do they set the direction for their football program and really insert it in the business world? And the results were profound. And over time, what I started to do was to draw the parallels that it doesn't matter really what sector we're talking about or even what sport we're talking about. The best coaches, truly have that DNA, that blueprint of what greatness consists of. And I think number one, the biggest thing I learned is that, it is not only an ongoing and consistent, a relentless effort to build culture, but number two, they connect a deeper purpose to it. It's not just about winning games. It's about, hey, we want to build young men. We want to build young men for the game of life. We want to build young men to not only get an opportunity to play at the next level, but we want to build great young men that's going to make a difference in society. And one of the reasons I went to Indiana, we were joking offline here before we started because you're a Purdue guy. One of the reasons why I went to Indiana over Georgia and Tennessee and some of the big football scholarship offers I received is because my head coach at the time, Terry Hepner, he looked me directly in the eyes and said, you come to Indiana, you're going to get a great education. You're going to get an opportunity to play in the NFL, yes. But more importantly, one day, I can promise you, looking me directly in the eyes and said, you will be more successful and make a bigger impact outside of the game of football than you ever will playing the game of football. And at that moment, Kevin, I didn't know the magnitude of those words that he spoke to me. But it really changed my life forever. That football's, what I did is not who I am. So that is one key lesson that I learned about building culture is that it's tying it to a deeper purpose. One of the other things I learned is that, really it has to be in every function of your company, right? It has to be every function of your program. I think one of the great things football coaches do is not only do they consistently communicate what the culture is, but they drive clear expectations of how that fits into your, offense, defense, special teams, etc. And the best leaders in the business world do the same thing. It's not just saying, hey, we want to build a great culture. It's tying culture to the day-to-day. It's tying culture and the behaviors that we want to mimic out in the marketplace every single day. Every team meeting, we're talking about what greatness looks like. We're talking about what not to do. So I think those are really some of the big lessons I learned from the game of football, particularly as it relates to leaders driving and building culture, because it starts there.
So Jeremy, who's with us on LinkedIn, says, I think often leaders get focused on the enormous scale of changing culture instead of focusing on what the next step they can take right now to lead towards that future. Culture is much more than words painted on the wall. I think he's sort of reinforcing and thumbs upping, if you will, what we've been talking about, and so I appreciate you sharing that, Jeremy. And then he goes on to say, building people for more than just the job they're being paid for, and that now this is me now. That's a cultural expectation, right? Your coach, who is probably one of the most beloved in Indiana football history, saw that it was about something different and something bigger, and that is why he persuaded you to come join him as a Hoosier. So I think that's a useful and valuable thing. So in the book, you talk about, I think it's 5 things that are components of a great culture, and we don't have time to unpack them all, because besides, we want everyone to make sure they get a copy. We are talking with Matt Mayberry, the author of the new book, Culture is the Way. Here it is. You see it behind him if you're watching us as well. And of course, you can go get it wherever you choose. So you talk about a variety of things, keys to a great culture, but what are just a couple of them, maybe that you feel led to share today? A couple of keys, like components we ought to. Oh, are
you there, Kevin?
I have lost your sound. Yep, I am here, and I lost your sound, but I think you're back.
Do you hear me now?
I do.
Can you hear me? Perfect. Yep. Yeah, and so those 5 things, really what the first question you asked me about what I learned from the game of football, these 5 things are really, it's an accumulation of kind of those 5 learning lessons of what I've seen of what does it take to build and consistently develop a great culture. And then also for the past 12 years, getting a front row view and, what do the best organizations in the business world do, and what are those similarities? And that very first ingredient, is that I think it's massively overlooked. And it's the importance of defining your culture. And the easiest way I can, drive some clarity around what this really means is that, let's say you have 20 employees that work at the same company, and you ask those employees, what is your culture here? 9 out of 10 times, you're probably going to get 20 different responses. So what happens in the best football programs and also in the best organizations in the business world, if you ask those 20 employees, what is your culture here? What does it consist of? How can you define your culture? They're probably going to give you a pretty similar answer as to what that culture looks like, what it is and why they work there, why they play there on that particular team. So that very first step is defining your culture. And I talk about the importance of a cultural purpose statement. And this cultural purpose statement is really it could be a tagline, it could be a mantra, it could be, whatever that is, to unite the organization into one defining mechanism, as far as this is our internal definition of why we're here, why we're a team, why we're an organization, and what our culture consists of. Now, mind you, this is just the first step in the process, because I just said words alone don't build culture. Hanging your core values on the website at your headquarters doesn't build culture, but it does hold an important place in the very beginning as far as defining your culture. One of the organizations I share in the book about their process of kind of changing culture and really building a healthy, high-performing culture, they picked a cultural purpose statement of get better today together, GBTT. And this was all predicated on the fact of, we have our behaviors, we have our values, what's important to us, we have our mission and all of that. But the internal forcing mechanism of what defines our culture is get better today together. That if we just get better today for this particular day together as a team, we're eventually going to get to where we want to go. So really their whole entire culture, everything is revolved around that cultural purpose statement. So I kind of take the readers through the process of how do you define that? Why is it important? And really trying to draw a different lens on the importance of defining your culture. The second step, like you said, we won't have enough time to dive into all five, but the second step kind of reverse engineers that process, right? So the cultural purpose statement is for a senior leadership team to define their culture. It's more of a top-down directive, right? There's no micromanaging involved. It's not the, command and control type leadership, but at the end of the day, leaders build culture. Leaders drive what their culture is and how you define it. After you define your culture, it's all about reverse engineering into driving and connecting from a deeper level of engaging the hearts and minds of every single employee within your organization. And really this consists of, Kevin, I lay it out in the book with really a roadmap on how can senior leaders strategically engage all people managers within the company to reel them into that process. So you're co-creating your culture together to drive more commitment, but also for those people managers to get with their direct reports. And then you're having a cascade all throughout the organization about what's important to us. What do we need to change and improve on? Why do you work here? Are you fulfilled here? What makes this workplace very special and meaningful? And then from there, right, it's turning the values into specific behaviors. I word it in the book as a behavioral manifesto, which is simply a one-page document of taking your values and drawing very clear, distinct parallels into how do we behave in this organization, in this workplace, and why is that important? So those are really the first two mechanisms of that 5-step process to build a world-class culture. And then from there, it's taking everything out, and then it's an ongoing, like I've already kind of talked about and hit on, consistent process from there.
So you said something, you say it in the book, and you said it in a way just now, and I'm going to put it on the screen. And for those who aren't watching, here's what I'm putting up here: top down directed, bottom up created. So I want you to say more about that. But before you do, my observation is that oftentimes there are folks in organizations at levels anywhere below the C-suite that are saying, well, man, we ought to be changing that, but that doesn't belong to us. That's somebody else's job. So talk to us about what you mean when you say a little bit more about what you mean when you say top down directed, but bottom up created.
Yeah, I think it's really so important. And I don't think it's just important for cultural change. I think it's important for really any kind of change or transformation within an organization. And I think that, again, drawing back to the comparison with football coaches, I think they're some of the best examples in the world. And even in the book, I kind of make the comparison. I'm not comparing being a business leader and being a college football coach, of which job is harder. But I am drawing the parallel of, why I believe football coaches are some of the best cultural builders out there, because everybody has talent. But one of the things I talk about, and also dive deep into the book as far as, defining your culture, as I mentioned, it is top down. The leaders of an organization have to define the culture. They have to define what it is, what is our behavior, why is it important, and also what is our identity from an internal perspective. Because every company has a mission statement, but that's more external focused, for the marketplace and for your customers, suppliers, et cetera. But how many companies and really spend enough time on the internal employee experience of what defines us internally? So that is top down. Bottom up then from there is, really all about driving the expectations. But then from there, it's, I think Tom Peters mentioned the importance of management by wandering around, recognizing that you don't have all the answers, and that's okay. The very best leaders I've ever been around, they do an exceptional job of defining the culture, driving clear expectations. But then from there, they're constantly asking, what can we change? What can we improve on? Are you happy? Do you have everything that you need to do your job to the best of your ability? And they're letting the employees and they're letting their team members kind of create and be involved in that process. So it's co-created. And the power of co-creation is enormous. I think I can write multiple chapters on the power of really co-creation and what that could do from not only a culture perspective, but also for a morale perspective. So that top-down, bottom-up creative perspective is really the leader's got to define the culture. From there, after you drive those clear expectations of what that culture is, you then have to get out there. You have to get out in the market. You have to get out in the four walls of your organization and talk to people, what's bugging them, what's eating them alive, what's keeping them up at night. And then also, what are they yearning for from a deeper level? What are they yearning for from their development perspective, both personally and professionally? And then finding a way to draw that gap, right, to shorten that gap of how can we put this in place for our workplace.
So there's a big idea in the book that we don't have time to unpack, but the point is that even once you've created this behavioral picture, once you've created the ideal, or what we would call the aspirational culture, there's still a lot more work to do, right? So and we could have a whole another conversation on that, but my question would be this: once we get past the first kinds of steps that we've talked about, what's the thing that most organizations forget or leave out after that?
Oh man. You got a couple hours? If I had to pick one, I think the biggest gap, as far as why most organizations may fall short in their efforts to build and cultivate a world-class culture of what world-class looks like for them in their organization, in their sector and industry. Without a doubt, it would be leaders role modeling the culture that they want in the workplace. I think a lot of leaders don't understand the significance and importance. They may hear it like, yeah, how I behave, and it's way more important than what comes out of my mouth and what I communicate. But when you go through the day to day, and I use the reference of, if you walk around with the leader for 30 days and you mimic, watch what's coming out of their mouth, watch what they're communicating to the rest of the organization, but then you also tie, how are they behaving? How are they behaving behind closed doors? Are they truly mimicking and living and bringing to life their values and behaviors that they so and want their workplace? And I think if you just focus on that, like an obsessive focus on every people manager and all leaders within the company truly living and bringing to life the culture, that's when you start to change and cultivate, cultural excellence from that alone. I've seen so many organizations go through so much effort, so much time, so much energy, put so many resources to building culture. But then, 1 month later, 2 months later, 3 months later, the leaders stop living and bringing to life those values, those behaviors that they preach on every single day. So without a doubt, Kevin, it would be that the leaders have to have a relentless and obsessive focus on really having a self-observation every day. Am I living this culture? Am I truly bringing to life what we want this culture to be for this organization?
Before we shift gears and start to wrap this up, you've been working with organizations for a long time, as you said, in this area. But 3 years ago, almost exactly 3 years ago, as it turns out, we had this thing called a virus, right? And a pandemic and a lockdown. So what advice do you have if organizations are doing what you're describing, but they're doing it at a distance? Anything that you would say or add to our conversation if people are doing it at a distance?
Yeah, I think that, especially from, I think right now, Kevin, you're probably seeing a lot of this too in your work is, I think you're seeing hybrid, atmospheres and environments where, maybe 2 days out of the week, certain part of the organization's coming into the office and then everyone else's work from home. But I think one of the biggest things, is that not only does communication have to be up to par and kind of consistent and ongoing and almost fanatical when you're in the office, but when you have that hybrid environment, and even if you're doing it away at a distance, it even has to be more so. So as a leader, I think that consists of having those one-on-one meetings more frequently, both from a formal and informal perspective. And then also as it relates to building culture, I mean, you have to really be tying culture and the culture that you want. I think you use the terms aspirational culture, talking about what success looks like from an organizational cultural perspective and everything that you do. I know it sounds so much of common sense, but common sense isn't always common practice. And I think one of the very best things, and I talk about it in the book, is that the best football coaches, I mean, they're constantly saying the same things over and over and over and over again, just in different ways. They're finding different case studies, they're finding different stories, they're finding different poems, they're finding different things that they've maybe watched on film, from a game, and they're integrating that into their team meetings, they're integrating that into their position meetings, they're constantly highlighting what excellence looks like and what it does not look like for their culture. And I think in the workplace, we as leaders can do the same thing, especially if we're doing it at a distance. The other thing I think that has to be done, is even more so when you're doing it from afar, is catching people do the right thing. Catching people do the right thing. I was just with a leader a couple months ago, and they were having huge morale issues. They were having a very tough time to retain top talent. And one of the very first things I said, give me 30 days. Let me sit in on, team meetings. Let me go to the sales operational sides. Let me go to the finance side. Let me just spend some time here on what's really going on. And at the very core of it, I mean, there were multiple operational and strategic issues going on, but at the very core of it, the leaders in that organization did not feel the need to catch people do the right thing because that was in their job title. That was in their job description. So they didn't feel that they had to go out of their way to tell Susie, you did a phenomenal job in that particular meeting with that client. This is why. But at the end of the day, when we're talking about building culture, I mean, you have to highlight what those wins look like. You have to highlight not only what those wins look like, but that brings immense amount of fulfillment to people's life, when you're catching them do the right thing. And that sends a domino effect throughout the organization of what greatness, what excellence looks like, while you're also bringing deep fulfillment to people's lives by catching them do the right thing and carry out your mission and build your culture. So, Kevin, those are a few things that I would share. I mean, obviously, there's way more, tactical and strategic things that we can get into, but those are some of the big things that I would keep an eye on.
Changing direction. Matt, when you're not writing and consulting and coaching and speaking, what do you do for fun?
Oh, man, that's a great question. My wife would, if she was here right now, she would probably say nothing. But, the reason why I think she would say that is because I really, really deeply enjoy, just hanging out with my family, my friends, whether that's going out to dinner. I'm a big movie person, even though I read a new book every single week. When I'm not on the road traveling, I travel over 200 plus days a year, every year, and have for the past really 8 years. I just love to relax and kind of kick back. And whether I'm watching Netflix or watching a documentary, really just hang out with my family, my wife, and my close friends.
Speaking of reading, the only thing you knew I was going to ask you was this, and that's, so what are you reading, or what's something you've read recently that people might be interested in?
So I just started it, so I can't give you my full, overview on kind of what I think of the book, but I just started a book called The Comfort Crisis. I think the author's name is Michael Easter. So there's been a couple leaders who told me about the impact and power of that book, as far as, getting back to how discomfort is, really beneficial for our lives, how it can add so much value and bring so much clarity to many things that we do from both a personal, professional perspective. So I've only finished the first 2 chapters, but so far I really like it. But that's the book I'm reading right now. I did finish Trust and Inspire by Stephen Covey recently. I believe that's his new book, the author of Speed of Trust. So that was a book he released, I believe, last year.
Trust and Inspire and The Comfort Crisis, both will be in the show notes. And so you can get those wherever you might want. But now the question you've been most wanting me to ask you, Matt, where can we learn more about you? Where do you want to point people? I'll hold up the book for people that are watching. Culture is the Way. Where do you want to point people? How can they get connected with you? What do you want to tell them?
Yeah, so the easiest and most efficient way is probably just my website at mattmayberryonline.com. I'm on all the social media channels. So LinkedIn, I'm very active on, Twitter, Instagram, and that's just Matt_Mayberry. So mattmayberryonline.com, and then, all the social media outlets, LinkedIn, Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram, and so forth at Matt_Mayberry.
And if you go to mattmayberryonline.com, you can get connected to go ahead and getting the copy of the book, or you can go to Amazon or anywhere you wish to get your copy of Culture is the Way, how leaders at every level build an organization for speed, impact, and excellence. And now, before we go, the question that I ask all of you who are watching and listening every week, if you've been here before, you know the question. The question is this: now what? What action are you going to take as a result of this? Maybe you realize that there are things that you can do, even if you're not a senior executive. And maybe what you were challenged with today was thinking about how are you role modeling the behaviors to help create the culture that you want. Maybe you were inspired to think about, how do I share with others in my organization that we ought to be thinking about culture differently? I don't know what those things are for you, but what I do know is that if you don't take some action on what we've talked about today, you might have been better off watching Netflix. So the fact is that we hope that today we inspired you and educated you and gave you new insights, but none of that matters if you don't take action. And I certainly hope that you do that. Matt, thanks so much for being here. It's a pleasure to have you.
Thanks so much for having me, Kevin. I really appreciate it.
And everybody, we'll be back next week with another episode of the Remarkable Leadership Podcast. If you liked it, go to your platform and say that you did. Give us a rating. We'd love that. And tell your friends to come join us, because we'll be back next week with another episode of the Remarkable Leadership Podcast. Thanks, everybody.